Good morning, students. So in previous video we discussed about the importance of tissue and what is tissue and the levels of organization in different organisms. Now let's discuss about the difference between plant tissue and animal tissue so that afterwards we can discuss in detail about the different types of plant tissue. We know that plants do not move, whereas animals move from one place to another for food, for reproduction, for shelter, etc. So, in case of plants, where the plants are stationary, they do not require much energy, and most of the tissue which they require is supportive, just to provide mechanical strength for making hole in the soil. Whereas in case of animal tissue, where the animals move, there is wearing and tearing, there is a damage of tissue, they require a lot of energy. In that case, the most of the tissue is living. Where in case of plants, where most of the tissue is supportive, the tissue is dead. So in plants, the most of the tissue is dead, whereas in case of animals, the most of the tissue is living. So here look, this is the first difference, that most of the tissue is dead just to provide the support to the plant, whereas in case of animal most of the tissue is living, and a plant tissue requires less energy for its maintenance, whereas animal tissue, where there is a wearing and tearing, animals move from one place to another, they have high metabolism, so they require more energy as compared to the animals. Now if we look at the growth in the plants, in case of plants the growth is not uniform, it occurs in only in particular areas. Now when I will discuss about the different types of plant tissues, I will let you know that in which areas of plants growth occur. Whereas in case of animals, like in case of human beings, there is a uniform growth, means the proportion of the growth of our limbs will be according to our body stature. So in case of plants, the growth is in the limited regions. It means the tissue which is involved in the growth is present in particular areas, whereas in case of animals there is a uniform growth. So in plants, the growth which occur, that is the tissue which is involved in the growth, it divides continuously throughout the life. It means there are some tissues in plants that divide throughout their life and are localized in certain regions, whereas in case of animals the growth is not unlimited, it is limited. It occurs, like in case of human beings, the growth of the body occurs only up to the age of adolescent, you can say up to the 17 or 18 age, that's it. So in animals growth is limited, in animal tissue growth is limited, whereas in the plant tissue growth is unlimited. In case of plant tissue, the tissue complexity is not as much as in case of animals. So the structural organization in plants is not as much complex as in animals, whereas in the animals the structural organization is far specialized and complex in animals. So that's a little bit idea about the difference between plant tissue and animal tissue. So at least 4 differences you must know. Like it is the dead tissue, it is a living tissue, it requires less energy, it requires more energy, growth is unlimited, growth is limited, hair growth occur in particular region, hair growth occur uniformly throughout the body. There is a both dividing and non-dividing tissue, whereas in animals there is no such demarcation. So these are the differences you must know. So now let's move to the next topic, that is plant tissue. In case of plants, there are two types of tissues. One is the meristematic tissue, which is present in particular areas. That's what I was talking, that in case of the plants, the the dividing tissue is located at specific place, and that dividing tissue is known as the meristematic tissue. And the another one is the non-dividing tissue, which performs a particular function. We call it as permanent tissue. In meristematic tissue, based on the location that where they are present, whether they are present at the tip or at the point from where side branches arise, we call it as intercalary meristem, or on the lateral side of the plant, we call it as lateral meristem. So there are three types of dividing tissues based on their location: apical, intercalary, and lateral. Permanent tissue. Permanent tissue means which stops dividing and performs specific function. There are further two types: simple permanent tissue and complex permanent tissue. So one by one I will discuss about parenchyma, collenchyma, sclerenchyma. Then in complex there are two types of tissues, xylem and phloem. These both are the vascular tissues which help in the transportation of water and food inside the body, in the plant body. I will discuss about the difference between simple permanent and complex permanent tissue. So this is a little bit idea about the different types of plant tissue, that is meristematic tissue, permanent tissue, then meristematic tissue for the three types, permanent tissue two types. So let's discuss in detail about first about the meristematic tissue. Before discussing about the meristematic tissue, let's discuss about the differences between the meristematic tissue and permanent tissue, and that is the difference between simple permanent tissue and complex permanent tissue. So meristematic tissue, its components are living. These are small, spherical, and undifferentiated. The word is here undifferentiated. Undifferentiated means those cells which do not perform particular function and they just grow and divide. I'm repeating, those cells which do not perform specific metabolic function, they just grow and divide and add new tissue to the cell. We call that tissue as undifferentiated. So meristematic tissue is undifferentiated, whereas in case of permanent tissue, the tissue can be living or dead and the tissue is differentiated, means when the tissue stops dividing and starts performing a particular function. So meristematic tissue grows and divide regularly, whereas permanent tissue do not divide and perform specific function. Here in the meristematic tissue, vacuoles are absent. Why? Because metabolically they are very active. They will just grow and they will divide, so there is no need to store food. We know that vacuoles store food. So permanent tissue, which is relatively less metabolically active and can store food, in that case vacuoles are present. Here, intracellular spaces. What is intracellular spaces? A space between the different cells. In the tissue, in tissue there are cells, and in between the cells there is a space we call intracellular space. If intracellular spaces are present, it is permanent tissue, or sometimes in the permanent tissue we will see the intracellular spaces may be absent. But in the meristematic tissue, the intracellular spaces are always absent. In meristematic tissue, cell wall is thin and elastic, whereas in permanent tissue, cell wall may be thin or thick. Here the nucleus is large and prominent. Large nucleus is present because that cell has to divide, and two nuclei, equal nuclei, will move to the two daughter cells. Whereas in the case of the permanent tissue, nucleus is smaller as compared to the meristematic cells. So it is a simple tissue, whereas the permanent tissue can be simple or it can be complex. So that's all about the differences between meristematic tissue and permanent tissue. So just read these points, and if you have any query, you feel free to ask me on WhatsApp. If we look at the differences between simple permanent tissue and complex permanent tissue, Simple permanent tissue is that tissue which is made up of only one type of cells. In one particular tissue, there will be all one kind of cells. Whereas in the complex permanent tissue, more than one type of cells. More than one type of cells. Like when we will talk about the xylem. Xylem consists of 4 types of cells. So the tissue which is made up of only one type of cells is known as simple permanent tissue, whereas the tissue which is made up of more than one type of cells, we call it as complex permanent tissue. In simple permanent tissue, the cells somehow perform one particular function. Cells may be similar or dissimilar, but they will perform one particular function. But here in permanent tissue, in a one particular tissue, different types of cells perform different types of functions. Here there is an exception, like in xylem. In case of xylem tracheids help in transportation of water, whereas xylem parenchyma stores food. So in one particular tissue, different cells perform different function in case of complex permanent tissue, whereas in case of simple permanent tissue, different types of cells, maybe same type of cells, they will perform one common function. So simple permanent tissue, as we discussed, there are 3 types of simple permanent tissue, that is parenchyma, collenchyma and sclerenchyma. And in case of complex permanent tissue, there are 2 types of complex permanent tissue, that is xylem and phloem. So that's all about the introduction of the plant tissue. So you must know about the types of plant tissue, then the difference between meristematic tissue and permanent tissue, and then the difference between simple permanent tissue and complex permanent tissue. So in my next video, now we will start discussing about the types of plant tissue. First of all, we will discuss about the meristematic tissue, then we will discuss in detail about the permanent tissue. Thank you.